All right, now that we have covered the main features for the visual, let's dive deeper into the initial setup. So what I've done here is I've opened up the sample, which you can download in the description, and I just removed some of the fields. So when you download the sample, there's going to be some fields here, so it's not a completely blank visual. But for this purpose, to go through the fields, I have purposely removed them. So the first thing you got to know is that for the visual, there are two mandatory fields, and that's the X and Y axis value. Now, one of the things to remember about these two fields, these accept only numerical values. So currently, a category-based scatter plot is not possible. Now, the way and how you use them, pretty simple. Use any of the columns or a measure if you have it in both of the fields. So for example, I'm going to use frequency in the x-axis, and I'm going to use recency on the y-axis. And you can see the chart does what it's supposed to do. It's going to create a data point based on a summarized version of both of those. Now, if you want to split this particular data point into multiple ones, you need to allow the visual to understand based on what am I supposed to split it. So this is where the category field comes in. The category field has two purposes. One of them is to define, for example, if I add a segment, that the segment is the category on which I'm splitting the data point apart. The other thing what the segment, or sorry, not the segment, but the category does is it allows you to define the drill down levels. So for example, if we have segment, I'm also going to have a subsegment, and then afterwards, I'm going to add customer ID. Once I do this, you can see the visual reloads and make sure it has everything in calculations. Now that once I click on new customers, I drill down into subsegment. If I click on one of the subsegments, I drill down into particular customer IDs. So that's the main idea here, right? The X and Y axis and the category to split the nodes by something smaller. Now I'm just going to reset the visual, go back to the highest level and remove customer ID, for example, because we don't really need all that information straight away. All right, so the next one is going to be the legend field. So the legends field main purpose is to allow you to define, for example, how these items are going to be split. Is there some sort of logic behind them? So you could, of course, use things like the same category or a subsegment or something like that, but you could also use a completely different category. In this case, one of the key points to also notice is that you cannot use the same field from the data that you have used in the categories. So for example, if I'm going to be using the same segment in the legend, you're going to see the visual throws out an error. Now, in order to avoid it, you simply need just a copy of the exact same. There you go. Now it works just fine. So once I added it, what it does is you can see it automatically activates the legend down below. In the formatting options, you can go ahead, open it up, and of course, customize it, reposition it, change the font families, colors, and so forth. But the main purpose of the legend is to allow you to group the items underneath. So for example, currently, you can say I have 4 different main categories, so 4 different legend items. If I click, for example, on new customers, I drill down underneath it, and all the nodes are in the same category, so they're all also in the same color. Now, if we go back and use, for example, a different category, so instead of a subsegment, I'm going to be using customer ID just for the purpose of having more items underneath it. You're going to see the same principle. So instead of new customers, this time I'm going to open up, for example, VIP customers. If I click on it, drill down, you can see that all the items that are underneath are going to be, again, in the same color. So that's the main idea there. You allow the visual to understand what's the correlation between the items and the category or the legend that you're defining on top of it. So that's for that. After that, we have the label. Now, when it comes to the label field, there are a few things you want to know about it. So the label field's purpose is to allow you to determine the name of the particular data point. So when you start off with a completely default scatter visual, you're going to notice that you don't have any names for the nodes itself. So a way on how you provide them is divided into 2 separate sort of approaches. One of them is through the label field, which you can use any column that you have already in the data set. And I'm going to be using just a column right here, using a label. That's going to provide a label for everything, but that's a sample, right? So the main idea here is you provide the text directly from your data source. So this can be either a calculated column or it's already coming from the original data source. You can define it and just pass it through the data. If I go underneath to the lower levels, you can see same approach again here. It's going to be labeled everywhere. So it's using the name that you have provided through the data. Alternatively, if you don't want to provide any specific name or override sort of different behaviors, you can go into the formatting options, open up data points default, scroll down a bit, and find this property right here called use category as label. So what this is going to do is you're telling to the visual that, hey, even though I don't have anything in the label field, I want you to use the category and the values within the categories as the label names. So for example, let's see, we have a VIP right here. So those are segment VIP customers. I drill down into it. And now if I zoom in closer, you can see individual customer IDs. So those are just different approaches on how you can control the labels for the data points. Now, after the labels, we're going to have a value label. Same approach. By default, it's essentially using a summarized version of 2 if you want to use it, or not showcase anything at all. You just want to have data points. Alternatively, if you want the points to have some sort of a value, so for example, I don't know, I want to showcase some M-score, right? I just add in the value label, and you can see that on top of the nodes, you're going to have values now. And you can use also, again, different aggregation forms. You can use summarization, you can use averages, you can use min, max, count, and so forth. So this allows you to play around with the visual again a bit more. Now, once we have the labels, the value labels added, we also have a few additional fields here. These ones are going to be a bit more interesting. So, for example, marker colors. The field allows you to define the color for the particular data point. One thing to note here is, for example, if I'm going to be adding a color, and for the colors, I would usually recommend to use hex codes. You can, of course, use color names, but it's going to be more precise if you use hex codes, because then you can defer the shades between different colors as well a lot easier. So, for example, if I drag in a color field into marker colors, you can see nothing changes. Why is that? Well, that's because currently the colors are defined through the legends field. Remember, we added the legend, which essentially divided it into groups. Okay, so if I remove the legends, it should be working, right? Well, it's still not going to be any different. The reason for that is because under formatting options and data points default category again, you can see there's an option called color mode. And by default, this is going to be sitting on auto, meaning that it's going to be going through the palette and assigning based on different variables. If you want the color to come through the field that you have defined, you need to switch this to dynamic. Now, once you do that, you can see the colors changed and they're following my logic that I essentially have created in the dataset. And again, this can be either coming directly as pre-calculated value, or it can also be a calculated column that you just created with DAX. So it allows you for further customization. One interesting approach that you can do with this is, for example, you can still use the legend as an item to create groups, for example, but use the marker colors to, for example, distinguish any outliers, or if you want to apply some custom conditional formatting. So that's a way on how you can do this. Similar approach has also been taken to the marker shapes. So if you're using legends, you're going to notice that the legends are already, for example, let's do it actually right here, where we have this segment cat. There we go. Let's add it here. So if we go into formatting options, you can see we have this legend shape and it's used default. So it's just whatever we have set as a default, but I can kind of switch around them and so forth. But I'm going to leave them all back on default and I'm going to add a shape. So marker shape, let's find shape test 2, for example, drag it in. You can see it all changes to droplets, for example. But if I go afterwards in the legend shape, I'm going to start to change something here, and this is not working anymore, right? So for example, if I switch to rhombus, or if I switch to anything else, the marker shapes are taking a higher priority. So it's just something to take a note on how these two variables kind of connect or communicate with each other, and to find the right approach there. But the cool thing about this is that it's a similar approach as with the colors, right? It allows you to create conditional formatting, so you can define shapes based on different categories. You can define the rules through the DAX a lot easier now. So that's an approach you can easily use here as well. Now, once we have the colors, the shapes, we also have something interesting. We also have marker images. So images is something that you can easily add to the nodes again, right on top of them. You can define how they look. Different shapes are going to visualize it slightly differently, of course, because it kind of has to fit in there. But the most important thing about the images is you need to remember that the value needs to be provided as a base 64 code. The reason for this is because the scatter visual is a Power BI certified visual, and certification means that we cannot access any external resources. So it would also mean we cannot access pictures which are hosted somewhere outside like SharePoint, OneDrive, or just somewhere publicly, right? They need to be embedded in the dataset. And base 64 is one of the approaches that you can utilize for this. So that goes for the marker images. The data point groups is an interesting settings. Even though we already have, for example, legends, which kind of creates groups for you, the data point groups is another property which allows you to group them even more separately. So for example, if I already have a pre-calculated column where essentially you can see I'm taking the legend items and separating them into two different groups, I can use that column in the data point groups, then go into the formatting options, and there's going to be two new fields, sorry, not fields, but tabs right here. And what I can do with them is I can say, hey, data point group 1 is actually something I want to customize individually. The marker shape is not going to be dynamic. It's not going to be coming through the data. I want them always to be diamonds. The color mode, instead of having, again, either some sort of automatic logic following the parent logic from the legend, I could say, hey, these are going to be fixed. The color I'm going to be choosing is going to be this turquoise one. So you can also apply additional level of customization for individual groups if this is, of course, needed. If you don't need it, simply don't use it. It's as simple as that. And the last thing we have here is a tooltip field. So you've seen this before in other visuals as well. The tooltip field allows you to add additional information when you're hovering over the node. So for example, when we hover over it, that's the default information that the visual provides. Based on the fields that you have within the visual, it's also going to change dynamically. But if I wanted to have something additional here, let's say I want to have the M score, I want to have the R score. So if I hover over, you can see that information is now displayed. And one cool thing to note about the tooltip is that if you, for example, want to have ability on to comparing two different data points, you can do the following. You can go into the formatting options, scroll down, find navigation, and switch the right-click behavior from Power BI context menu, which is this one, where you have drill through and all those other options, to so-called default context menu. So this is going to be using our context menu. And what this allows you to do is, for example, you can click on one of the nodes, right-click, and you can see this calls out the same tooltip, but it's sort of locked in place. You can close it if you want to, of course, but it's physically stuck there. And you can then hover over a different node and have two tooltips simultaneously and kind of compare the values or see, for example, what's the difference between them and so forth. So that allows you for even more further kind of advanced analytics. So that's going to be it about the fields. Hope that it was insightful, and make sure to try out all of them to see what else you can do with them. Now, once we go through this, the next thing we're going to cover is going to be the interactions to see, okay, once I have set up the visual, how do I actually use it?